I am Sarah Milligan. I'm the department head for the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program, which is a research division of the Oklahoma State University Library. And we are really pleased to be hosting today's presentation, Rooted and Silenced Black Women in Resistance. And I love this title for multiple reasons. So thank you for coming up with it. But we will be hearing from two presenters today. The first one will be Autumn Brown. Autumn is our graduate research assistant the last 2 years here at the OOHRP. And she's going to be sharing a presentation, Organize, Activate, Liberate, Black Women, Educators, and Quiet Resistance of Radical Pedagogy in Oklahoma City during the Civil Rights. And following Autumn, we'll be hearing from Michelle Lanier with a talk, Rooted, Womanist Cartography, Black Southern Women and the Monumental Remapping of American South. And both of these works are focused not only on documenting the stories and history of Black women, but utilizing oral history and ethnographic methodologies to help share those stories. So I guess we will start with Autumn, but I'd like to actually introduce you to both of our panelists today before we get started. And know that they will share some discussion points. Feel free to chat, put questions in the chat. And if there are things that we can wait until the end of the presentations, we will. If there's other questions that come up in the middle that we need to ask for clarification, we can kind of chat and do some of that as well. But to start, Autumn Brown is a doctoral candidate of the Oklahoma State University in the university's Social Foundations of Education's department. As I mentioned, she is a graduate student or graduate research assistant with the OOHRP, and she's a member of the Tri-City Collective, whose work is driven by a passion for social justice and creative expression. And if you want to know more about the Tri-City Collective, you can look them up. They do really great work in Tulsa, Oklahoma City, and Chicago is the Tri-City part of that. I think that's where the initial questions that always comes out. Autumn has served as a presenter at national conferences such as the American Educational Studies Association, American Educational Research Association, and the Oral History Association, which is where Autumn and Michelle first met for this discussion. Autumn, I'm going to let you wrangle.
Oh, wait, you're muted, Sarah.
I think you muted me whenever. I ended up in the mute bucket. Autumn's published articles on women's embodiment in education, and she has 2 chapters coming up that are looking at Douglas High School in Oklahoma City and doing biographical research on Black women teacher activists. She's earned her Master's of Education from the University of Central Oklahoma in Edmond and her Bachelor of Science from St. Gregory's in Shawnee. She's finishing up her dissertation this semester in educational biography of Clara Luper, an educational pioneer during the period of segregation. So we'll be hearing from Autumn first. And just to give you all a preview as well, Michelle Lanier is an Afro-Carolina folklorist, oral historian, museum professional, filmmaker, and educator of over 2 decades of commitments to her calling. I love the phrasing. Raised in both Columbia and Hilton Head, South Carolina, and having ancestral roots in Sandhills, Coastal Plain, and Upper Piedmont of North Carolina, Michelle's ancestral geography guides much of her interdisciplinary work. As a seasoned public humanities professional in 2018, Michelle was named as the first African-American director of all North Carolina's 25 state-owned historic sites. So you can imagine she's been busy this week managing everything going on with weather affected in space. In 2008, Michelle successfully advocated for legislation creating the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, which she led as its founding executive director. She's also served on the faculty of the Center for Documentary Studies at Duke University since 2000, which has led to her role as the documenting doula, also a very fantastic term. most notably working with award-winning Mossville, When Green Trees Fell, looking at the global South story of resistance to environmental racism. Michelle's traveled to Panama and Ghana to document African diaspora folkways, and her ethnographic work on funerary traditions of St. Helena Island, South Carolina, led her to a role in North Carolina's inaugural liaison to the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, which she now serves as an appointed commissioner. I'm so glad to have that you could join us today, Michelle, and I'm glad that all of you all today that are joining us in Zoom could come with us, the wonders of sharing things virtually for a wide and broad audience. So from here, I'm going to pass the reins over to Autumn and open up my chat.
Okay, and I'm going to share my screen, but I've got to let in some folks, so just a second. Sarah, because folks are still trickling in and I'm going to share my screen, I'm going to go ahead and make you the host. And if you'll just, because people are still trickling in, so I want you to be able to let them in while I'm giving the presentation. So let me do that. Okay. See, they keep coming. They keep coming. Okay. Okay. Okay, Sarah, you're the host now. And okay, and I can share my screen. Okay, so thank you guys for joining us today. The title of this panel, Rooted in Silenced Black Women in Resistance, just to kind of piggyback off what Sarah said, Michelle and I met at the 2020 annual OOHA Oral History Association conference, where we gave such an amazing and what I felt was like a riveting conversation that we had to just repeat it and follow up and put it on for Oklahoma State University. So thank you guys for everyone who's tuning in. And I want to start my presentation today by just going and talking about broadly what is oral history. And I want to start here because we're going to come full circle back here at the end of my presentation. So starting out with talking about what is oral history. According to the Oral History Manual, oral history is a primary source material created in an interview setting with witness to or participant in an event or a way of life for the purpose of preserving the information and making it available to others. So as a research methodology, oral history lends itself to a variety of uses of settings in both within and without the walls of academia. Through oral histories and archival documents, we gain insight into the daily lives of extraordinary people who may have remained anonymous otherwise. The goal of oral history, we do the interviews, we collect the information, and then what? The goal of oral histories are to create archives, and archives in itself is a hard word to define, but according to the Society of American Archivists, archives are a collection of documents created or gathered by one person or institution and selected for long-term preservation. But truth be told, if you've ever kept a scrapbook or a diary, then you have some experience archiving material. And so archives for the culture. While archives preserve materials of enduring value, they're often seen as sacred places that hold important historical documents, which only elite scholars may have access to. Therefore, within archives are inherent silences and gaps in what archives collect and who they serve, which largely leaves out a multitude of voices and experiences in our society's shared history. So creating community archives can combat this phenomenon. Community archives can serve as tools to build communities. They empower those who are marginalized by mainstream media, and community archives create a stable, multicultural, multi-ethnic, and multi-generational community. They also establish a sense of belonging in a multitude of ways, and community archives can also work toward ensuring justice. So as an oral historian and we often try to consider the long-term value of our work, even for people who aren't even born yet. So 2 years ago, I started working with the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. And what started out as a research project meant to preserve the history of schools and education in Northeast Oklahoma City turned into my research project. And the title is here. And you'll see 3 dynamic women, Clara Luper, Ada Lois Scipio Fisher, and Nancy Randolph Davis. These 3 women, along with the social network in Oklahoma City that was out of this world, helped change the democratic landscape in the city. This oral history project that was supported through OOHRP, ultimately, like I said, turned into my dissertation project. And coming to my dissertation project was kind of a come to Jesus. Originally, for the last 3 or 4 years in my program, I was studying Black women in STEM. And when it came time to finally put stuff on paper, I was just at a loss. And I really had to take a step back from this process. I had to take a step back from the academy and just insulate myself with friends and family and community. And what happened was I started to revisit the stories my dad would tell me about his teachers, Clara Luper, and his teacher, Miss Davis, and just the impact that they had on the community. Spencer, Oklahoma. And Spencer, Oklahoma is where my dad's from, and that's where he went to Dungy Schools, which is a segregated annex of Choctaw Public Schools in Oklahoma. And Spencer was a big part of my community. It was a big part of my upbringing. And so for me, I had to move away from such a hostile topic into one that was more motivating, into one that was more inspiring, and into one that was more closely aligned to my family history, my community, and this type of impact I wanted to have on the city. And so Vanessa Siddle Walker, she says that to remember segregated schools largely by recalling only their poor resources presents a historically incomplete picture. So often when we speak of segregated schools, we talk about the state of education for African Americans pre-Brown as a glass half full point of view. But on the contrary, these all Black schools provided unique predicaments for the teachers, the female teachers that worked in them. It offered them the chance to activate their students and into seeking justice and basic human rights. So more than that, these women transformed their teaching into a political act. And Clara Luper herself leveraged her role as a teacher to generate involvement in the NAACP Youth Council, which had previously suffered from non-participation and non-support. So while I am only highlighting Luper for the dissertation, I want to make a strong point and say that Ada Lois Scipio Fisher and Nancy Randolph Davis were also a large part of this movement, and I want to equally pay them homage. And when I finish the dissertation, I fully plan on writing a book that will more deeply dive into their histories. So I want to talk about Clara Luper and who she was, a political activist and educational visionary. She was from Okfuskee County, Oklahoma. That was her hometown. She loved to read. She longed to visit a library. She was educated at what she would call a fireside university. She attended Langston University from 1940 to 1944, where she met friends and also teacher activists Ada Fisher and Nancy Davis. And I just want to say that there was definitely something in the water at Langston, and there still is, because so much Black excellence has been bred at that university. She was the first Black student admitted into the graduate program at OU, and she was a history teacher at Dungy Schools for almost 20 years. One event that was a major catalyst in her life was the passing of her brother Ulysses, who died from pneumonia. And I'm going to talk about that more in depth later. So, okay. So Clara Luper was a very strategic person. She leveraged her role as a teacher to garner support and participation in the Youth Council. In her book, Behold the Walls, she says, there was no advisor youth council membership relationship then. It was a far deeper feeling that I had for the NAACP Youth Council members. I had watched them grow up from infancy. I had seen their minds develop and the values with which they carry their lives change. This is an example of how Luper's role as a teacher had transformed into something much bigger and much deeper. I think we all know that teachers do more than just teach during a traditional school day, but through Luper's words, we bear witness to just how her relationship with her students teeter on the familial side, and also points to a form of teaching we most commonly call womanist teaching. Also, context like this is important to know as I include Luper's living room as a data source. One thing I'm doing with this study is I'm using Black feminist theory, and I'm putting a Black feminist lens on how I'm collecting data and what I'm considering as data sources. And in the Oklahoma Historical Center, there is a replica of Luper's living room. And in her book, she says it was a small 5-room white frame house. So often the question is asked, what do we consider data? In my opinion, data can be any source of material that adds deeper meaning, value, or context to what we do or who is understudied. Luper's living room was a key site for her youth council members. And here's where her students organized since returning from their trip to New York City. Clara Luper was a strategist, and she wrote a play called Brother President based off of the nonviolent movement of Martin Luther King. That play earned her and her students a trip to New York City, where they put it on the larger NAACP Youth Council conference. And so she took students from Spencer, Oklahoma, who had never left Spencer, Oklahoma, on a bus trip to New York City. On the way to New York City, she took the northern route so her students could experience integration. And then coming back, she took the southern route so that they could compare and contrast how they felt being able to sit at a lunch counter versus having to brown paper bag it and eat on the bus. So when the group got back home, they decided that will be our project, to eliminate segregation and public accommodations. So the magic of what happened and what happened in Luper's student-led sit-in, it began in her living room. So it renders this replica of her living room an important data source to include as I build out her educational biography. Her living room transformed into an educational space, a space where her students learn the doctrine of nonviolence, and a space where her students autonomously planned the longest and most successful sit-in movement in history. Luper planted the seed, and like any good gardener, she fostered healthy growing conditions for her students, empowering them to be the change they wanted to see. Her living room was an incubator that cared and protected these children. So I include Luper's living room as a material way of understanding her life, expanding on details that are not available in existing literature. So I talk a little bit about Clara Luper and some of the content and context of her work. And to examine Luper's work only as a teacher activist during the historical period of her teaching tenure is an analysis that would only paint half the picture. She says, I was born in Okfuskee County and grew up in Okmulgee County, where segregation was a way of life. And one thing I noticed, the pecan tree had the largest pecans, had to be picked by whites, and the small pecans were picked by Blacks. And I couldn't understand that. And my dad said, someday you will understand. I think that sometimes we all have events in our lives that catalyze and become kind of a burning fuel or a justification for our work. And a lot of Clara's early life greatly shaped the desegregation movements and efforts she made throughout this movement. But one thing that really deeply impacted her was the passing of her brother. And her brother, Ulysses Luper, who she says was the most brilliant and most handsome. He got sick with a cold. It turned into pneumonia. They took him to a hospital in Henrietta, but because of segregation, they wouldn't look at him, and he ended up dying. And she said, I don't know anything that has touched me as deeply as that. So, like I said, there are things that occur in our lives, a catalyst event or set of events that latch themselves onto our spirits, affecting the imprint we leave on the world. For Luper, these events largely include her brother dying, her inability to enter a library and read books, her father being called a boy a subtle reminder of their subhuman existence, living amid segregation. So as I mentioned previously, I am using Black feminism and oral history. So I completely put a Black feminist lens on the work I'm doing. One thing that I'm doing as I'm looking at Clara Luper's activism is I'm looking at forms of activism displayed by Black women through a Black feminist lens. Oftentimes, we only consider activist activity that is overt, public demonstrations, but based on Black feminist theory, Black women can display activism just for group survival. And that form of activism is just as important to consider. And in ways, Clara Luper's activism was overt through her sit-in movement, but in other ways, it was just enacting group survival in her classroom, in her living room. And so one quote that I love to use to kind of like surmise why Black feminism is so important as a theoretical perspective for me is, we have performed the labor, they have received the profits. We have planted the veins, they have eaten the fruits of them. This quote sums up the human world as I know it and the social politics that move the world in this way. The vibrancy of Black women's voices and intellectual contributions are powerful, yet exist in a constant state of questioning, or they're ignored altogether. So Black feminist theory takes a stance, a critical one at that, and it remains vigilant in bringing to the fore the thoughts and ideas of Black women who often fail to reap the profits from their labor. So oral history through a Black feminist lens integrates the lives of Black women into historical scholarship. Throughout this study, I am intentionally focused on amplifying the voices of Black women and their contributions. In addition to that, I'm highlighting the central form of activism and action less known in civil rights history. Therefore, I use a Black feminist approach to theorize Luper's work as a teacher activist for the advancement of Black people. But I'm also contributing to a history that's dear to me, my family's history, and the history of the community in which I was raised. So using Black feminist theory, I aim to credit the women who planted the veins during civil rights in Oklahoma and reap the fruit that has had intergenerational effects on a community, the history of a state, and our contemporary education system. And so that brings us back full circle to why this is important. I said previously that oral history is meant to create archives, and archives are meant to produce information for publicly accessible use for generations who are not even born yet. And what I'm doing with this study is making sure that the lives of Clara Luper, Ada Lois Scipio Fisher, and Nancy Randolph Davis, within context, and their work as teacher activists, are made accessible for Black women like me who didn't have such information available, and for the future of my family in order to keep this history and community history alive. So thank you guys for listening. I'm going to turn it back to Sarah so that Michelle can get started. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Autumn. That actually was really great. We have a side thing that happened. We had a little Zoom bomb happen at the beginning of that talk, and I'm trying to clear the chat. Just if you saw that happen. Moving along, having some permission problems. Following up from Autumn's talk, though, we're now going to pass the screen over to Michelle. Michelle, let me know if I need to change permissions for you to be able to share your screen.
Thank you. It was not allowing me to unmute myself since I wasn't host. Thank you. And thank you for acknowledging the Zoom bomb. I am going to share my screen. I'm going to start us off first with some breath and with an image. So if you could, if you're able to sit up, that would be great. I am going to share an image with you all. Okay. Alrighty. So here's where we will begin. This is an image by Allison Janae Hamilton. This is from her most recent work. She is an artist who works with folk narratives, particularly in the Black South, or what I will call the Afro South. And this image reminds me of my own girlhood that I will touch upon in my presentation momentarily. But I think we need a bit of a healing moment. I know that a lot of us are dealing with the trauma of a pandemic, the trauma of having been Zoom bombed, the trauma of ICE. So I just wanted to ground us for a moment before we sink into these concepts that are very sacred to me and I hope will be compelling to you. So what exercise I do with my students and various collectives I belong to that you may be familiar with, it's called square breathing, where you kind of think about making a square with your breath by inhaling for the count of 4, holding for the count of 4, exhaling for the count of 4, and then holding. And so I just like to do 2 cycles of that just to ground us. And I would invite you to breathe with me. Breath is sacred. So inhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Inhale, hold, 2, 3, 4. Exhale, 2, 3, 4. Hold, 2, 3, 4. Thank you for breathing with me. So I wanted to share with you a few images that I am going to be holding inside of my mind and my spirit as I share words, and then I will dive into some words. So we have this. I'm going to invite you to think about the fact that the image, this looks like one girl and 3 girls at the same time. There is something allegoric about her posture. There is playfulness, but there is something foreboding also in the background. There's curiosity. There's beauty. There is the sense that this girl has been adorned. Our eyes look at the red and the hand and the feet. We can feel our feet walking along the fallen palm trees that only exist in certain ecosystems in the South. And we can wonder of the stories that surround these girls or this singular girl. We can imagine what the land has witnessed. Another image by Allison Janae Hamilton, Florida water 4. Many of you may know the significance of Florida water in a variety of African diaspora spiritual traditions. We see the feet. We see a white dress held aloft, not in air, but in water. We see the reference to magic. She is walking on and in water. There appears to be a grate under her. What is that? What is beneath the grate? Her hands are mirrored above. Is she flying or drowning, resurrecting, rebirthing? Is she a ghost? Is she spirits? Is she the Middle Passage spirits that walk the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean? Another image We see a reference to the Commedia dell'arte masks of Italy, most, commonly associated with Venice. We just had Mardi Gras yesterday. So we can think of the masquerade. She is running. Where is she running? Whose church is this behind her? What are the trees hearing in her heart? This woman, for me, reminds me of the great mothers, the matriarchs, the anchors of Black communities in the South. She is dressed for church, but appears to have just come back from the hunt with a pheasant in her hand, and not just a hat or a headdress, but a mask. She looks as if she grew from the earth. These images, and I'm going to stop sharing in just a moment. These images are, you can look at these images more closely. The online version of my article, Rooted, that I will put in the chat. I'll put the link. So it appeared in Southern Cultures. I'm gonna stop sharing, and I'm going to, is the chat still disabled, Sarah? Okay, the chat is still disabled. What I'll do is I am going to call out the name of, or the URL. It's very simple, y'all. It's just Southern Cultures, all one word, .org, /article/rooted, ROOTED. I'll say that again, southerncultures.org, /article/rooted. And so feel free to go to that website while I'm talking, and you'll be able to see those images at your leisure. And so I am now going to share the words that for me correspond with those images, and I'm going to keep a close eye on time. Salt water flows in my veins, and I can recall my first taste of the Atlantic Ocean at 2 years old. I grew up hearing stories of how a 6-year-old boy and girl, my maternal grandparents, met on a sandy South Carolina road and first experienced the spark that created my extended family. On this same road, Hurricane Hazel would one day claim Aunt Net's beach house, which she, the family's matriarch, had proudly built in the all-Black resort town. Undeterred by that loss, that same boy, now grandfather and patriarch of the family, would awaken the whole house, sometimes neighbors too, and start a journey at 4 a.m. on a whim. We would all pile with our pillows into the wood-paneled station wagon and head for Atlantic Beach. We were beach people, but we were not from the beach. I was a child of the beach only in that I knew how to dance on sand, eat crab, and ride waves. We would return there, sleeping 3 or 4 to a bed in Black-owned hotels. We would visit Black dentists' widows who stayed for weeks. We would go to the Black-owned arcade to flirt and groove, and over the years, bring the cremated ashes of our own, including my mother, Margaret Odell Caution McCullers. We were beach people, but we did not belong to the coastal Black world. We were outsiders from the Midlands who would come to visit the sea and then return to the center of the state of South Carolina, where we bought fish for Friday's dinner at markets rather than catch it ourselves. So when my mother took a job as an administrator at a school on Hilton Head Island, the beach people, my mother and I, did not immediately become locals, but remained outsiders who were now island residents. Moving at the age of 7 to Hilton Head Island, almost 200 miles away, was a monumental shift. It was intrastate, yes, but the coast was culturally a universe away from the capital city of Columbia. We spoke differently as we were from the city south. We were not Gullah or Geechee by birth, but we would soon become city Southerners wrapped up in Gullah love, and we would be welcomed and transformed. Over time, my otherness shifted. I began bonding with the land and the people, and the land and the people of the Low Country are intrinsically tied. I learned to move in that land and was drawn to her mysteries most of all. I was intrigued by the flesh and rhythm of a black snake I saw on our back patio. I would pull the prehistoric horseshoe crab by the tail to make designs in the sand with her feet. The dead jellyfish who hadn't made it back out to sea was subject to my dissecting sticks. I would indeed feed marshmallows to the alligator who lived in our neighborhood lagoon and somehow survived scratching its back with a long branch. Acts I now know to be dangerous and extra legal. I was 9 and it was 1984. I ate blackberries picked from wild bushes. I ran from trees that seemed to sprout worms in the spring and dug fossilized crustaceans from white sand and earth. I began to learn that and realize that I lived in a cultural heart of Gullah Geechee people, particularly because of the work of Emory Campbell, who was a director of the Penn Center. I remember him taking us on an excursion to Dafusky Island. We had to get there by boat. Dark brown male hands helped pull my smaller brown hands ashore. People gathered and words were delivered. We spoke of loss of land and culture, hotels and gated neighborhoods like the ones on Hilton Head Island that were called plantations, where Black people worked as maids and cooks on land that they had once owned after the Civil War. We ate frogmore stew, which is a low country boil of crab and shrimp, sausage and new potatoes and corn over rice, of course, always rice. And I walked a short distance down a sandy road flanked by live oaks and Spanish moss. And this was an island, so that road ended in water. If you could picture a still from a Casey Lemon's Eve's Bayou or Julie Dash's Daughters of the Dust or Beyonce's Lemonade album or Gloria Naylor's Mama Day or the magical realist photographs of Allison Janae Hamilton, you'll have some sense of that moment. I looked back over the water because I wondered if someone related to me who I had never met was staring across the water into my eyes as well. That was my calling into folklore, but it also was my calling into understanding the power of place and the connection to human narratives, which has led me to create a concept that I call womanist cartography. So when seeking new language for this work, I am inspired to offer up womanist cartography from Alice Walker of Edenton, Georgia's definition of womanish as frivolous, irresponsible, the opposite of frivolous and irresponsible or girlish, a Black feminist, that is me, or a feminist of color, from the Black folk expression of mothers to female children, you act in womanish. It also means to want to know more and in greater depth than it is considered good for one. Considered good by whom, I asked. Womanist cartography recenters Black women and femmes by rendering our narratives visible, audible, legible, and autonomous. So ultimately what I'm sharing with you all today is a methodology that I use particularly in Afro-Carolina. The goal of this approach is to renegotiate Black femme presences in the American South. If cartography is the art of creating maps, of revealing the imagined borders and renaming practices by those arrogant enough to claim dominion over water and land, counter cartographies and restorative cartographies are powerful tools for centering the marginalized and for repairing the fissures between one's ancestral landscapes and ancestral memories, particularly in the face of traumatic histories. I think of Autumn referencing the pecan trees and the map. That is womanist cartography. But map making is not new to Black women. There was Louise Elizabeth Jefferson, who was a Black woman cartographer, who was a designer, photographer, multimedia documentary artist, who actually created a map called Americans of Negro Lineage in 1946. There are also other kinds of maps: visceral maps, aural, sound maps, sonic maps, that help us to understand the intimacies of daily lives while guarding against the specters of colonial voyeurism and appropriation. If we cannot listen to the voices of the living through oral history, then the voices of newspapers, old cassettes, census records, photos, and indeed maps give voice. Voices like Virginia Jenny Graves Williams of Caswell County, North Carolina. As a child, I was spoiled to my granddaddy. He used to call me baby. I'm the baby. That was my name. I never heard him say Virginia. It was always the baby. What he did was he planted a whole field of popcorn for me. Virginia's mother's name was Ruby Apple. Ruby Apple. She was born at home on April 14, 1922 in Caswell County, and according to Virginia, there was a midwife that birthed her. Ruby's mother died young, and she owned only one dress. She washed it and dried it by the fire and pressed it with an iron daily. As a little girl worn down by teasing children who had realized Ruby wore the same dress every day, Ruby stopped going to school and began working at a white family's home in Caswell County, making bread. Too small to reach the counter, she was placed on a stool. Ruby Apple, Caswell County. Girls of the same age as Ruby Apple at the time of this memory now play under the leadership of her daughter, Virginia, who leads a recreational center in the same Caswell County. I'll share another. Patsy Piety, a freedom seeker. She ran away from slavery or was stolen. She was called a bright mulatto woman. She also had a girl child of 4 years old. She was known to be talented for making also bread. She was also a seamstress. She also knew how to make beer. She ran away twice, the second time to marry a free man of color. Patsy changed her name to Piety. She was a shapeshifter, and she redefined Halifax County, North Carolina. I will say that there's so much more to share of this methodology, and I will end with a series of questions that I ask myself. And I'm going to say names that you will not know. And that's part of the work is if you visit that website that I shared with you, you will be able to see the footnotes and learn more about some of these people. So I have a litany of questions that I am asking myself as I dig into what is Afro-Carolina through the lives, the dreams, the feet of Black women. What is Afro-Carolina? For the particular experiences and lived dreams, uprisings, and survivals of all Black Southern women, My question is, how do we reveal the hidden markers of their lives on the land, where there are no signs, where there are no monuments? What are the appropriate monuments? How do we remember and remember them, pulling them back together like a quilt? How do we populate this map and find our way back to our mother's gardens time and time again? Where are the maps that trace the trails to our ancestral Black mothers, their horrors and their hallelujahs? We ask more questions. Who was the woman that white supremacist Julian Shakespeare Carr said, quote, he horsewhipped until her skirts hung in shreds, end quote, after hiding in the buildings of the University of North Carolina, supposedly guarded by Union troops? Who washed the bodies and packed the satchels for the souls caught up and run out of Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, the year of the Great Massacre? Who twirled in crinolines in tobacco warehouses to Maceo Parker's horn? Who grinded a mean and sensual dog in juke joints and at homecoming dances fueled by corn liquor and love? Who sat dignified and festooned in pastels at the Church of God in Christ or Kojic pink tea? Who hosted the girls' dormitory strategy sessions at Bennett College for Women for freedom making that happened on January of 1960, but was birthed on February 1st in Greensboro at the Woolworths on February 1st, 1960? What are our ancestral mothers' names? What did they call their journeying lands, their sojourning lands? Perhaps Texana, that is the name of a Black town in North Carolina. What did the soil literally look like and smell like where they laid their heads? I want to know. What are the names of the soils that held and hold our mother's bones? What were the ecosystems that witnessed their fallings and uprisings? We know that certain species are now gone. The Carolina parakeet and the passenger pigeon. I know we have to wrap up, but there are so many more questions that could be shared. And I encourage you all to think geographically about the intersections of Black women's narratives on the land and how we can render them visible through performance, through billboards, through attire, through adornment, through music, and through monuments. Thank you. Oh, yes.
Michelle, if you want to pass the host duties back over to me, I'm going to try and see if we've fixed some of the permission stuff on the back end. I think at this point, if anybody has any questions, let's see if we can raise a hand, and I'll make it where you can unmute yourself if you have a question. And let's try it that way, since the chat is still doing. Haven't been able to clear it. Oh.
Alexis?
Yes. Since this presentation is being recorded, if we'll be able to go back and watch it.
Yeah, it'll be, it's recorded through the Oklahoma Oral History Research Program. I think we will make it available on our website, Sarah. So we're gonna do. Okay, yeah. So if you go to the Oklahoma State website, you can just type in Oklahoma Oral History Research Program and it'll take you right to our website.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions or thoughts? Any other research that you, lines or that you want to tie into this or share?
I think there was a hand.
Oh yeah, Allison, go ahead.
Hi, thank you both ladies. These were amazing presentations. I have a question about cartography. Can you explain that a little bit more, Michelle? Because that's the first time I'm hearing that use. So I just kind of want to get a better understanding of what that is.
So a cartography in the simplest form is literally the making of a map. So if you were to say, I'm going to make a map, if you were to go into a software database and you were to map all the places you've lived or all the places that your ancestors have lived, that's a form of cartography. You're creating a map. And so what I'm interested in doing is overlaying on top of the maps that are already in place. They don't have to stay that way. I can say this is where Anne Grace lived. This is where I lived. This is where I first saw an alligator, or this is where I received my calling to the work of folklore. So we can create new maps for ourselves, and we can make them interactive with the kinds of media access that we have now. We can be able to click on a point on a map and hear a song or a poem or an oral history excerpt. So we can connect narrative to place. You could go around with your cell phone and geocache and find a place and click something, and maybe if you have virtual reality technology, see the hologram of an ancestor or a historic figure, or create some Afrofuturistic dreaming around what we would hope to see in Black communities that have been decimated, by gentrification. But I love, Autumn, the way you deal with place. You use maps in your presentation, and you also use interiors. And I was just wondering if you could say a word about the importance of the interior life of Black women in your work as a Black feminist oral historian.
Yeah, so I think just looking at the intimate details of these women's lives really kind of just adds to the context of how I'm theorizing their work as teacher activists. I think it would be to just look at, like I said, to just look at their tenure as teachers and say, well, they did this, this, and this, and therefore I'm gonna draw my analysis based off of this information. That's what I'm looking for. It cancels out the impact of like Claire's brother dying, or the impact that Nancy's father had on her. Like one thing that resonated with me was both of these women had fathers who had dreams for them that they went on to pursue. So Clara Luper's dad, her dad would always say, like, one day you're going to be able to go and read and sit in these schools. One day you're going to be able to sit down at a counter and eat and drink. And Nancy Davis's dad said, one day you're going to go to this Oklahoma agricultural school. I think one day they're going to let Black students in. And so like looking at those contexts and those intimate details of their lives, aside and along with their work as teachers, I think it creates a more whole picture, a more holistic picture of just their lives as teacher activists that don't just relegate them solely to their role as teachers. And then it also creates a space for people to relate. I mean, I can relate to having a father have like dreams for you and kind of like transfer that onto you, and then the work that you do to make those dreams into like an actualization. And so for me, it was really important to look at every part of these women's lives and include that into the analysis, because I feel like that presents these women as whole women rather than just taking bits and pieces of them and then just capitalizing off of it or commodifying it in that way.
Thank you. Yes, it humanizes in so many ways that the archive, I think, is without, a connection to the fullness of someone's life. We shouldn't have full access to someone's whole life. There does need to be boundaries, but I do think humanizing someone and giving more texture to, you know, the intimacies of the fact that social justice work and movement building is birthed out of homes at kitchen tables and on settees and couches.
Yeah. And I think like when you talk about it, like the humanization of it, it's like we're humanizing a group of individuals who are constantly dehumanized. And so it takes almost like radical efforts to almost just deconstruct those ideals around Black women's lives.
Yes.
And present them as whole. Like we like to sit down at a counter and drink a Coke too.
That's
or
right.
Go into a store and try on shoes and clothes as well. So
that's right. And I think about, when I think about space and place in my work, you know, being a director of 25 historic sites, many of them are Civil War related or Civil War battlefields. This summer, I was a part of the leadership team that dismantled 3 Confederate monuments on the North Carolina State Capitol grounds. And so that now means that when we think about the state capitol of South Carolina, we think of Bree Newsome now on that flagpole taking down a battle flag. That is a kind of womanist cartography. She is created through that activist performance, a marking, a moment that can be marked on a map. We know exactly where that happened. We can create the longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates of where that happened. This, you can stand there. This is the place that Bree Newsome did that work. And then you can stand there, you know, this is the place where Michelle Lanier stood with a collective to dismantle, you know, Confederate monuments. I can go on a battlefield, a Civil War battlefield, and change the story of that place just by my mere presence. That's a kind of mapping too.
And I think just kind of piggybacking off what you're saying, Michelle, in Oklahoma isn't regularly thought of as a state where like such radical activism can take place. Oklahoma is very much a red state. And so just the idea of, you know, a group of dynamic Black individuals radically transforming the democratic landscape of the state. I think it's something to be said. And for me personally, to go downtown and stand where Miss Luper and these children sat down at Kat's drugstore, or where she went into John A. Brown and demanded to be able to eat at the lunch counters, or where I could drive along the route she took to march to Lawton to desegregate Dodo's amusement park. So just kind of like recreating that space and going to those landmarks and knowing like magic took place here it's really special, especially within a state and a place that isn't regularly recognized for such events. So I appreciate your work, Michelle. And just like with OHA, like I love just listening to your stories. You're such a good storyteller. And the images are very vibrant. And I just want to say thank you so much for just sharing your knowledge with us among all of us today. And
thank you. I hope people will, you know, use your methods, you know, and centering Black women and their narratives. There are too many initiatives that will swirl around Black women or go over Black women. And you know, there are many ways that we can be included in stories. And so I honor your work as well. Thank you for introducing Ms. Luper to me. And so grateful to be a part of this gathering today.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody. We appreciate your time and your patience. I learned a lot today. I hope you all did as well, gave us some things to think about. We will share the recording of this, as Autumn said, on the OOHRP website, but also probably linked through our social media channels as well, so you'll be able to find it. Thanks so much, everybody. I have a great, whatever day this is, Thursday. It's that kind of week.
Bye, everyone.
Autumn, thank you for pulling this together. It was really, really thoughtful on everything.
Thank you for letting me. I'll see ya.
Okay. Did y'all want to stay on after, or did y'all want to?
Yeah, okay.
We can
I
stay
was
for a
like-
minute.
Okay, cool. I was just gonna call Sarah anyway, so we might as well just stay.
Okay.
I turned
And
over.
I apologize. I'm just lurking. This is
That's what I was
Mary.
about to
I'm
say.
just trying to do some of the background stuff to see what I can get rid of.
Mary is my associate dean, who I handed over hosting duty at some point. and said,
Hi, Dean, Mary.
Thanks for coming, Mary.
Mary, do you want to stop the recording?
Sure.